Hi everybody, and welcome to my first of two videos introducing the Nikon F3. This is the last of the all-manual focus Nikon professional grade cameras. It went to space with NASA and it set the benchmark for manual focus cameras, professional cameras, and it was produced for longer, I believe for longer than any other professional grade camera. And it's it has more variations than any other Nikon professional camera. This is a stunning piece of equipment, and we're going to learn all about it in the next two videos. So this is an interchangeable lens SLR camera, and what that means is that the lens can be taken off of the camera's body fairly simply, like that, and a different lens could be put on. SLR meaning single lens reflex, so one lens, the light comes in through the lens, hits the reflex mirror, which bounces it into the prism, which bounces it around a few more times and into your eye in the proper orientation. It has an 80-20 center-weighted light meter with a focusing in the central 12 millimeters of the image. So let's say that what you're seeing here represents the image that you would see looking through the Nikon F3. The central 12 millimeters would be about like my fingers are right now, maybe more like that. And that would represent 80% of, that's the outside of my fingers, by the way. And that would represent 80% of your metering data. And the rest of the scene would represent 20%. It has aperture priority shooting, meaning you can shoot it in manual mode by setting the shutter speed yourself, or you can shoot it in aperture priority mode by setting it at the A. And for shutter speeds, it had X, T, and B, which are flash sync, time, and bulb. We'll explain those in a second. The red numbers represent a full second or greater. And then 8 seconds up to 1/2000th of a second, which is pretty zippy. The X, T, and B, what those mean, X is your flash sync. Now you can flash sync it at 1/60th by setting it to 1/60th on the dial. Or you can set it to X. And flash sync means 1/60th is the fastest shutter speed at which it can sync. You can also use the flash without losing any of the image at 1/30th, the 15th, 8 seconds, whatever it would be. T is time. And what time means is you push the shutter release down and it opens the shutter. Push the shutter release again and it closes the shutter. And bulb means as long as you hold the shutter button down, the shutter will stay open. So the viewfinder magnification varied by lens and by the viewfinder. It also had an interchangeable focusing screen, and in the second video I'm going to show you guys how to change focusing screens and do some complex things like that. But there were 20 different focusing screen options for this, which is an enormous number. And so we'll see that in the second video. The X-Flash sync, I stated earlier that flash sync was 1/60th. I was incorrect about that. X-Flash sync is 1/80th of a second. And so when you set it to X in your dial, it syncs at 1/80th of a second. 1/60th is the fastest manual shutter speed at which you can sync a flash. So the target market for the Nikon F3 was professional users. It is the quintessential professional grade system camera. It doesn't have the largest system that went to the Canon F1, but it did have one of the most diverse systems and one of the widest ranges of uses for the system. But even though this was a professional grade body, it was bought by practically everyone. It was made for 21 years and it remained a very popular and top-selling camera for that time. And it's a great amateur and learner and mid-level and professional camera, and everyone used it and everyone loved it because it is honestly one of, if not the best, manual focus 35mm SLRs ever made. If it's not the best, it's certainly in the top 5. So this camera, because of all of the crazy expansion and because of everything it can do and its robust build and its really pretty attractive looks, was popular and remains popular to this day with photographers of all skills. It was made by Nikon from 1980 until 2001. This 1980s camera was made until after digital technology started taking hold. And also Nikon had guaranteed any buyer that parts for repair would be available for 20 years. Now I will tell you, as I've sent this off to be repaired, and Nikon said they don't have parts for it anymore and it's only 2014, so that didn't quite hold up. But in 1980, when they started manufacturing this camera, they required that any company providing component parts for the manufacture of this camera guarantee that those parts and materials would be sourceable for 20 years, which is basically how long this was produced for. It was produced in Japan. Prior to the F3, Nikon made the F2, and this is a natural evolution from it. This is actually a huge step up from the F2. The F2 kind of improved on the F. The F3 was a monumental step forward from the F2. So I'll tell you what, if you have your manual, go grab it. We're going to do an overview of the features, all the buttons on the camera and what they do. You'll see how to use them in the second video, but we're going to talk about what they are in this video. All right, starting here on the top of the camera, on technically the sides, we have the camera's strap lugs, and this is where you would attach your camera strap. We have the flash hot shoe over here, and it used the old F and F2 style flash that fit over this thing. Was really wonky, non-standard. Non-standard flashes are an awful idea, Sony. And so the flash had a coupler that fit over that. Then here we have the film rewind knob and the film rewind lever, which pops out. And here is the film rewind knob and film back release lock right there. From +2 to -2, that is the exposure compensation dial, and this little silver button right here is the exposure compensation dial lock. And you can see as I move it, there's a little white, well, right now there's a little white line right below 0, and now it's at 0. That's the exposure compensation index. And we'll talk about exposure compensation in the second video, but that's going to tell you, that little white line, whether or not you're compensating your exposure and by how much. Next up here we have the prism, and we'll take that off for a second, and you can see here is where the prism mounts the focusing screen, which can come out very easily. So while I have this off, this over here on the left, this little line, is the LCD display that displays your exposure information in your viewfinder. And over on the right is, and this little notch here allows you to see the aperture in your prism. And then over on the right is something which is used with other prisms than this one, and so I've never used it and I don't know exactly what it is. It might be an illumination. There's the illumination button right here, this little red thing. So that might be an internal light. Slide that back on. Here, this little white line on top, on the side of the prism, that is your shutter speed index, and that tells you what shutter speed you're set at. Here's your shutter speed dial, with which you would select your shutter speed, and the shutter dial will lock in X and it will lock in A. And this little silver button is your unlock. You just press it to unlock. In front of the shutter dial, there's a little lever. Let's see if I can get it. Sometimes it's tricky. There it goes. You can see there's a red, you might not be able to see. So there's a red dot, and if this is the self-timer lever. So when you can see the red dot, the self-timer is active, meaning that your next shot will count down from about 10 seconds. We also have right here behind the shutter, that little circle with a line through it is your film plane indicator. That's for exact measurements for macro photography and things like that, where you need to know exactly where your film is in terms of your distance to your subject. Here we have the film advance lever. After you take an image, you use this to advance the film. And let me take this off. This is a soft shutter release. It's not actually standard equipment. This little silver button is the shutter release button. And up in front of it, we have, you can see there's a little red dot there. That means that the camera would take photos if there were batteries in it. And right now it will not. So that little switch that I just flipped turns your camera on and off. It turns the meter on and off, but it also locks the shutter so you can't accidentally take an exposure. This little tooth right here is the double exposure lever, and we will see how to use that in the second video. And then this little triangle with a 0 in it right now is your exposure count window, which lets you know how many photos you've taken on your roll of film. Going now to the front of the camera, over here on the left we have the grip, and this was the first Nikon with a grip like that. It was the first Nikon with the red sash as well. The grip is really good, it's very ergonomic, and it's good for holding the camera. 80s cameras in general have had some of the best ergonomics until the last few years. And the red sash, which is just for design, but it looks cool, and this was the first Nikon with it, and most Nikons since then have had some kind of red design next to the grip. This little double light right here is your self-timer light. So next we have all kinds of levers and buttons on the front of this thing, just a ridiculous number of functions. So this little silver button is your depth of field preview button. Look inside of the mount right there. You can see as I press it, that little lever goes down, and what that does is engage the aperture coupling in the lens so that the lens iris stops down and you can get an idea of what's going to be in focus. Connected to the depth of field preview button is the MLU lever. Now, you can't just accidentally put this in MLU. This is a very good design, so you have to push down the depth of field preview and then flip the MLU lever out away from the housing, and that locks up the mirror, which allows you to do things such as astrophotography without the mirror bounce hitting your camera. Or you could also do timed photos that way and other things. Mirror lockup is an incredibly useful feature. I think it should be mandatory on professional grade cameras. In fact, one of the reasons I love this camera so much is it has every single feature I think a professional grade camera should have, and a couple that I think are nice to have, completely not mandatory. So here's an item that I don't really think is mandatory, but it is great to have in an electronic bodied camera. There's a lever right here on the side. I'm going to try, there we go. So flip it out a little bit, and this is your manual shutter override. Because this is an electronic camera, if your batteries die, then you're stuck. You can't advance the film, you can't unjam your shutter. You can't take any photos. This gives you about 1/60th of shutter speed, and it allows you to unjam your camera if your batteries die. And then it locks up to the side, it just folds into place so that you don't accidentally hit it. On this little dial, there's a little black button on the front of it, which you can push. That is your exposure memory button. And we're going to talk about the two major uses of that in the next video, how to do them, but what they are is it allows you to do stop-down metering on non-automatically indexed lenses, like this one. And that also allows you to do auto exposure lock, or when you have it in auto mode, so you can expose for one part of a scene, recompose, and take another, and take the image without having the exposure come in incorrect. Here we have the viewfinder illumination window. Depending on your viewfinder, all of these have that window, but it may or may not illuminate in your viewfinder. And what this does is this allows daylight into the viewfinder so that if you're taking a picture and you're in the shade and you're looking out at a daylight scene, the light coming in from the scene will illuminate the viewfinder so you can still read the LCD display. And if you've ever used a camera with out one of those and haven't been able to read the needle or the display when you need to, it's extremely useful to have that. This is the meter coupling pin right here, and next to it is a little silver button that you can push to flip the pin backwards. It's not easy to do that and demonstrate it. And so the meter coupling pin marries up with your lens meter pin so that as your lens's aperture spins, this dial spins and it communicates the aperture setting to your camera. Well, if you have a non-automatically indexing lens on your camera, then you'll pop that pin right off. So the pin folds back so that you can use NAI lenses. Now that was very important for this camera, and it remained in many of the professional grade cameras, if not all of them, up until it remained in the F4 and F5. I don't know about the F6. And some other high-end cameras that they made where you can flip the pin backwards. The reason being that professionals had a lot of money invested in non-automatically indexing lenses. And so Nikon didn't want to lose buyers because, well, if I got to replace all my lenses anyway, I might as well go to Canon or Pentax, right? So they put that in so that professionals could still use all of their NAI glass, albeit with limited functionality. Everything could still work the same way, but you had to do a couple of extra steps in the second video, those being the depth of field preview with memory, exposure memory that we'll talk about again in the second video for how to meter with NAI lenses. But that allowed pros to keep their NAI glass. This little white dot is the lens mounting index. So you line this up with your lens and then turn it counterclockwise to mount. This is the lens release. So you push it and you can see that little pin going into the body. This is your locking pin that keeps the lens from falling off the camera. So you push this and then you can unmount your lens, and we'll see how to do that in the second video. Here's the flash PC socket, and you can either use the hot shoe or the flash PC port to control a flash, and the PC port is definitely better for doing things like off-body flash work. So here we are on the camera's back. Here we have not much. We have the serial number and the Nikon made by, and the film back, and the memo holder, so when you take your 135 film out of the box, you just slide the box tab in here and you know exactly what type of film you have. Then we have the viewfinder window, and on the HP eyepiece and some of the others, it includes a lens shade, or a viewfinder shade rather, so that if you're doing long duration photography such as astrophotography, light doesn't come in through the eyepiece and fog your film. It also allows you to do extremely accurate exposure metering in automatic mode for things like macro photography or even tripod photography, because no light can come in through the viewfinder and alter the light meter reading. We also, and technically this is on the top and I missed this and I apologize, but here we have the ISO dial and it's built into the flash, but you lift up the ISO dial and turn it to set your film speed. Lift and trust me, that's what you do. So here we are on the camera's bottom, and there's a whole bunch going on here, a lot of things, including an unsightly dent right there, but that's okay. This camera's built like a tank, and that little dent is going to do nothing to how this camera operates. Over here we have the film back guide pin, and there's a little pin, this is the motor drive guide pin, and what happens is the motor drive has a little pin on it that fits in there to ensure that it aligns properly. This is the film rewind button. That's what you press when you're rewinding the film to make sure that to undo the sprocket, which we'll see in just a second. There's the motor drive coupling linkage right here, and that allows the motor drive to operate some of the camera's mechanics. We've got the tripod bushing right here, and then this is the battery chamber. This is where the two batteries are going to go. We'll see in the second video how to change them and the type of batteries that it takes. And this is the cover for the motor drive electrical contact. And so what you would do is you take that cover off to expose the electrical contacts, and having them under a cover prevents them from corroding and being damaged as readily as they are in some other models. So let's take a look inside the camera. To open the camera, You put your fingers on the film rewind knob, slide this little lever towards the prism, pull up, and the camera back opens. To make this a little bit easier, I'm going to take off the back of the camera. That's right, the film back comes off. Here we have the cassette placement chamber, and this is where your film cassette goes when you're loading it. This is a film guide roller that helps keep the film flat on plane. These are the 4 film guide rails. The outside guide rails keep the film from moving up and down as it travels, and the inside guide rails work with the film pressure plate, which we'll see in a second, to keep the film flat on plane. This is the shutter right here in the middle, don't touch it. These 2 electrical contacts are for data back or other interchangeable backs that can go on here. This is the film tension spring, and this is the film take-up spool right here. On the back, we have a guide roller right here. These are the film cassette. This is a film cassette spring that helps keep it in place, and this is the film pressure plate that helps keep film flat on plane. As you can see, there has been a lot of film that's gone through this camera. And you can tell by the brassing that this camera was very heavily used. The lady who gave it to me didn't know a ton about it. Her father had used it for a number of years, though she honestly had no idea what he used it for because she'd never seen any of his photos. Didn't even know he took any. So that was interesting. But at any rate, this camera's been very heavily used. And what that goes to show you is that these Nikon F3 bodies can be used, and in this camera's case, very possibly abused, extensively, and they will keep functioning because that's how well they were made. So this was the most heavily varied Nikon F model with 6 variants. In 1980, they released the F3, which is the stock F3 with a DE2 viewfinder, and that's just what it came with out of the box, and it was a great camera. In 1982, they released the F3 HP, or high eye point variant, the only difference being that the HP has the HP viewfinder. It's better for people with glasses. It raises the eyepiece a little bit. The DE3 prism, one thing to note is that most of this frame could be seen from up to 2.5 centimeters from the viewfinder. And the viewfinder did not allow 100% frame coverage. The F3 DE2 viewfinder did, but it still allowed you to look at the scene from further away. The F3T, the titanium, was released in 1982, and it's the same as the F3 HP, this camera that you're looking at, only it was made of titanium, making it even more durable. The F3P, released in 1983, is P for press or photojournalist, depending on who you ask. It included weather sealing, a different film back, a different focusing screen, a titanium prism. The F3 Limited was a scaled down F3P available only in Japan in 1994, and it used different electrical contacts and restricted the viewfinder accessories. So it's not the greatest of the great F3s. But the F3P is a fantastic camera. The F3H, which I believe was released in 1998, I couldn't find anything that referenced it earlier than that. H stands for high speed. It had a fixed pellicle mirror, and it could shoot at 13 frames per second with the special nickel-cadmium battery, and at 7.5 frames per second with alkaline AA batteries. Nikon stated that they only made 100 of these, but there may have actually been between 800 and 1,000 of them made. The Nikon F3H remains the fastest shutter speed frame rate of any camera, including DSLRs, as of early 2014. The next closest is, I believe, the Nikon D4S, which comes in at 11 frames per second. 13 is staggering. That is almost movie camera speed. For a still camera, think about it. 13 frames per second. If a 24 exposure roll of film is gone in 2 seconds, a 36 exposure roll of film is gone in 3 seconds. The F3AF AF is for autofocus. It included an AF viewfinder prism that looked like a gigantic tumor on its head, and it worked with two Nikkor AF lenses. So the AF had the AF mechanism in the prism and then an AF motor on the lenses, and kudos to Nikon for giving it the old college try, but it wasn't very good. The problem being that Nikon tried to retrofit an existing camera with autofocus capability. What they should have done was what they did later, create it from scratch in the camera. Fortunately, they kept the same mount, the S mount. From the initial Nikon F3 concept development to the first Nikon F3 being available for purchase in a store, 9 years passed. This was the first Nikon camera styled by Giorgetto Giugiaro, and many of his camera designs were gorgeous. That's not just my opinion, that's everyone who's right's opinion. This design was developed in 1977, and 5 years before the camera actually hit the shelves. Like I said, this was the first Nikon with the iconic, the now iconic red stripe or sash on the handle or grip. Like I said, also it was the longest running production time for any Nikon professional grade camera, and maybe any other. I can't remember how long the Canon F1 was produced for. Although if you count the 6x7 and its variants from Pentax, that did run for longer. But it was 4 different cameras. A modified F3 was used in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom to film the minecart point of view sequences. And so what they did was they took the F3 body and lens, and then they added basically a film, a motion camera to the back of it, and that allowed them to use this still camera to film motion. And all parts for this from the individual parts manufacturers were required to have a 20-year post-source supply until 2021, apparently. However, Nikon no longer services F3 bodies, and a lot of the parts are not available anymore. And so, for instance, mine has a bad LCD display that only works when it's really, really hot outside. I won't ever be able to get that replaced. And so I can only shoot mine in A mode because I can't ever tell whether something's over or underexposed in manual mode. This was the last manual focus professional film SLR from Nikon. And what a way to go out. This is a great camera. Also, one of the many backs on this was the Kodak DCS-100 digital back. And those used Nikon F3 bodies, and they were the very early digital cameras, and they put a digital back on it, and it was like 1/3 of a megapixel or something like that. Very old technology, big crop rate apparently. And it helped, I think, however, set Nikon up to be a very dominant digital camera company. So a few don'ts. Don't touch the camera shutter. If you put your finger in the shutter when it's open, you can brick your camera very easily. If you get finger oils on the shutter, they can degrade the shutter material very quickly. Don't touch the mirror that's inside the box because it's surface coated with silver and your finger oils can remove the coating. Don't leave your camera or lenses in your car. They can be damaged by heat, and the oils will get out of the places they're supposed to be and ruin other things. Don't store your camera in a plastic bag because it will get moisture in it. Same thing, don't store it in a plastic box. Moisture will get in there and it will grow fungus on your lenses and in your camera. And also, don't let your camera get wet, even if you have the one with a weather sealing, because these are old cameras and the weather sealing in the photojournalist versions will have started to break down. Just remember, your camera is a precision tool and it should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera, oh yes, your Nikon F3 will take care of you. This is a stellar, stellar piece of equipment. If this video was helpful, please leave me a thumbs up. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about responding quickly. If you have suggestions for other videos or ideas, please let me know. I'm more than happy to film videos for you if I have the equipment and the technical know-how. And one last thing before we go to photos taken with this camera. Thank you guys for watching. What is that over on the right? So that, oh dear. This was the first Nikon camera styled by Giorgetto Giugiaro.